The sirens were already wailing when the firetruck rounded the corner into Ember Street, but what they didn't expect to see was a lime-green golf cart with HOA stickers completely blocking the fire lane. It wasn't just parked there by accident, it was angled across the hydrant like someone had claimed it as private property. Smoke billowed from the second story of a pale yellow house as an elderly woman screamed from the upstairs window, clutching a cat and coughing uncontrollably. A firefighter leapt out and pointed to the hydrant, shouting that they needed access now. But the lane was blocked and the cart wouldn't budge. The fire chief muttered 2 words that would go down in suburban legend: "Chain it." And just like that, the firetruck lurched forward, dragging the golf cart with a screaming Karen chasing behind it, waving a clipboard like it was a sword. Phones came out. Neighbors gasped. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. And that's when the internet met Ember Street. 2 weeks earlier, the chaos hadn't yet begun. Ember Street was your average suburban cul-de-sac, where lawns were trimmed with military precision and mailboxes still received HOA newsletters that nobody read. But if you asked any resident to name the one thing more permanent than the oak tree planted at the center of the roundabout, they'd all say the same thing: Karen. Not a Karen, but the Karen. Short bob haircut, mirrored sunglasses, white SUV that never touched a speck of dirt, and a golf cart that she treated like a throne on wheels. As HOA president, she didn't run the neighborhood, she ruled it. Karen believed rules were suggestions for everyone but herself. She had fined residents for leaving their trash cans out for 35 minutes too long, for planting the wrong type of petunias, and for letting children draw with sidewalk chalk. But her greatest sin, by far, was the fire lane. The red-painted curb that ran along the north side of Ember Street was clearly marked: Fire lane, no parking. Everyone obeyed it. Everyone, that is, except Karen. Every morning, like clockwork, she would pull her golf cart right into the fire lane, wedge it next to the hydrant, and sit there with her latte and her clipboard, monitoring the street like she was guarding the crown jewels. When a neighbor politely asked her to move, she claimed official HOA business. When the mail carrier couldn't deliver packages, she said she was protecting the community from porch pirates. When the new couple down the block reported her to the city, she responded with a printed fine, $75 for disruptive communication via email. Things came to a head when a fire truck tried to do a test run down Ember Street as part of a routine inspection. The crew couldn't even make the turn because of Karen's cart. Fire Chief Logan stepped out himself, a man who looked like he was carved from redwood and smelled faintly of smoke and resolve. He walked up to Karen, calmly explained the importance of fire lane access, and handed her a formal warning. Karen laughed. Not just a chuckle, a full, head-thrown-back cackle. She told him the HOA had its own emergency protocol and accused him of harassment. She even posted about it on the neighborhood message board. Another power-hungry man trying to tell a responsible woman how to protect her block. Chief Logan returned to his truck and made a note in his log. One day, he muttered to his lieutenant, "That cart's gonna cost someone their life." The residents had long since stopped believing anything would change. Complaints went unanswered. The HOA board was packed with Karen's hand-picked allies, most of whom had mysteriously had their lawn violations disappear after joining. Whispers circulated about bribes, favoritism, even secret deals about who could use the clubhouse for free. But still, people didn't dare challenge her. Karen had a way of turning every criticism into a personal attack. She'd shown up uninvited to a teen's graduation party to measure fence height and accused the caterer of violating HOA food code. No one wanted to be next. Then came the day of the fire. It was a warm Saturday morning. The kind of day where sprinklers clicked on in perfect sequence and kids rode scooters in their pajamas. But at number 1463, an overloaded power strip in a guest bedroom shorted out, setting the drapes ablaze. Within minutes, smoke curled into the sky. The neighbor across the street, Mrs. Gonzalez, spotted it first and called 911 while banging on doors. The elderly couple inside didn't answer. Mr. and Mrs. Rowe, both in their late 70s, were hard of hearing. The fire was growing fast. The fire truck was there in less than 4 minutes. But they couldn't reach the hydrant. Karen's golf cart, parked as always like it owned the spot, blocked the fire lane and the hydrant both. A firefighter tried to move it manually. No luck. It was chained to a metal post Karen had installed for security. A crowbar wouldn't do it. Time was running out. That's when Chief Logan gave the order. The crew looped a heavy-duty chain from the fire truck to the undercarriage of the golf cart. Karen, hearing the ruckus, came running down the street in fuzzy slippers and a bathrobe, shouting about illegal towing and government overreach. But no one listened. The truck pulled forward. The chain tightened. With a screech and a jolt, the golf cart's rear wheels lifted off the ground. Sparks flew. Plastic scraped asphalt. The cart dragged behind the engine as it pulled forward just enough to reach the hydrant. Neighbors stood frozen, watching the scene unfold like it was a Hollywood movie. One teen streamed it live on social media. Another yelled, "Yo, she's gonna lose her mind." And she did. Karen screamed, threatened lawsuits, waved her HOA badge, and tried to block the firemen with her arms outstretched like she could physically stop a 20-ton engine. A firefighter calmly moved her aside. Within seconds, water blasted from the hose. The fire began to die down. Inside the house, the crew found Mr. Rowe slumped on the stairs. They carried him out as oxygen was administered. His wife had managed to make it to the balcony. Both survived, thanks to quick response, but everyone knew how close it had been. The next day, the footage of the fire truck dragging the golf cart was everywhere. YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, it exploded. Headlines read, "Firetruck vs. HOA Karen. Guess who wins?" Memes appeared overnight. Karen became the poster child for entitled obstruction. And Ember Street? For the first time in years, it was united against her. Because when a firetruck has to choose between saving lives and saving face, you better believe it's not stopping for a golf cart. Karen's voice could be heard from down the block before she even reached the firetruck. She came sprinting barefoot, bathrobe flapping behind her like a cape, her signature clipboard still in hand. Her screams were a mix of rage, disbelief, and something that sounded like a threat toward the city, the fire department, and anyone within earshot. By the time she reached the edge of the scorched fire lane, the firefighters had already subdued the blaze, packed up the hose, and unhooked the golf cart's remains from the chain. The cart now sat tilted on the curb with one wheel bent at an unnatural angle, the frame scraped, the front windshield cracked. Karen gasped when she saw it, falling to her knees dramatically like it was a fallen comrade in battle. Everyone around her just stared. Several neighbors who had come out during the commotion remained on their lawns, coffee mugs in hand, some recording discreetly. A few didn't bother hiding their amusement. Karen pointed a trembling finger at Chief Logan, shouting that he had violated her civil rights, committed grand theft, and would be sued for destruction of private property. Chief Logan didn't respond. He calmly walked toward her, handed her a written citation for obstruction of emergency services, and turned back to his truck. Karen tore the paper in half, threw it on the ground, and screamed that the HOA would have him fired by sundown. The truck pulled away slowly, passing the neighbors still lining the sidewalks, some applauding quietly. Others were already uploading clips to Reddit. The fallout from the dragging was immediate. That afternoon, local news vans showed up on Ember Street. One reporter tried to interview Karen, but she refused to speak unless the crew agreed to call her President Karen, Defender of Property Rights. The station declined and instead interviewed Mrs. Gonzalez, who had called 911. She spoke about how the firetruck's access had been blocked and how her elderly neighbors could have died because of it. Her voice shook as she described watching the flames through her kitchen window while Karen's cart sat there, unmoving and unapologetic. The news anchor added footage from the fire department's body cams, including the moment the chain was secured and the cart was dragged forward. That single 10-second clip became viral within hours. By the next morning, the story had exploded online. Reddit threads were flooded with memes of the golf cart being towed with captions like "Karen's Chariot of Entitlement" and "Parking Enforcement, Level 1000." Twitter was ablaze with hashtags like #GolfCartJustice and #KarenInTheWay. TikTokers reenacted the scene with tiny toy firetrucks and green Hot Wheels cars. Even a few celebrities chimed in, calling it the most satisfying thing they'd seen all year. But Karen, instead of laying low, decided to double down. She called an emergency HOA meeting that evening. Every resident was notified, through aggressively worded emails and printed flyers stuck into mailbox flags. The community center was packed, not out of loyalty, but because nobody wanted to miss the spectacle. Karen stood at the front in a freshly pressed pantsuit, visibly seething but trying to appear composed. Behind her, the HOA board members looked increasingly nervous. One of them, a man named Phil who had previously been her staunchest ally, wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Karen opened the meeting by declaring that the neighborhood had been attacked, not by fire, but by lawlessness. She accused the fire department of overreach, claimed she was targeted for being a woman in leadership, and even suggested the fire was staged to discredit her. Murmurs spread through the room, some people scoffing, others exchanging glances that screamed disbelief. Then she dropped her bombshell. She had hired an attorney and was suing the fire department, the city, and several neighbors for damages to her golf cart, emotional distress, and defamation. A hand went up in the back. It was Priya, a young lawyer who had moved in a year ago with her father. Karen had fined them $150 for having a welcome mat that said, "Namaste." Priya stood, cleared her throat, and asked if Karen had considered the ramifications of filing a public suit that would require sharing the HOA's internal records. Karen blinked. Someone coughed. Priya continued, explaining that a civil suit would open the HOA's internal communications, fines, financials, and enforcement patterns to legal scrutiny. Karen stammered and dismissed the concern, calling it a scare tactic from someone who still has an unpaid garden fine. The room's mood shifted. After the meeting, small groups of neighbors gathered in driveways and living rooms. Stories began pouring out. Mr. Halpern mentioned how Karen had demanded his granddaughter take down her lemonade stand because it didn't have a vendor permit. Mrs. Jensen recounted the time Karen accused her of harboring feral birds because she had a bird feeder. One man admitted he'd been too afraid to speak up after Karen fined him for parking an inch over his driveway line. But now, after the golf cart incident, it felt like the neighborhood had reached a breaking point. Ember Street wasn't just annoyed anymore. It was ready to fight back. The next day, Priya began drafting a formal petition to recall Karen as HOA president. She referenced a little-known clause in the HOA charter allowing a two-thirds majority of homeowners to call a vote to remove the president for conduct deemed damaging to the community's well-being and safety. It was an obscure section no one had ever used, probably because no one had dared. Priya posted it in the community app and within hours had dozens of digital signatures. The momentum was real. Karen, realizing something was shifting, began patrolling the neighborhood more aggressively. She took photos of trash bins, wrote citations for bushes she deemed too wild, and even confronted kids for drawing hopscotch on the sidewalk. But instead of scaring people into silence, it only pushed more residents to support the recall. Phil, the board member who had previously sided with her, publicly announced his resignation and called Karen's leadership toxic and embarrassing. Another board member followed suit. Meanwhile, the fire department remained quiet. Chief Logan refused to comment publicly, citing ongoing review procedures. But inside the department, support for him grew. Firefighters shared the incident video like a badge of honor. Even the mayor's office issued a quiet statement confirming the fire department had followed protocol in a life-or-death scenario. Karen's lawsuit had not only made her a neighborhood pariah, it had embarrassed the city. By the end of the week, the petition to remove Karen had reached critical mass. 73% of homeowners had signed. The vote was scheduled for the following Monday. Karen plastered the neighborhood with flyers claiming the vote was illegal, that outsiders were trying to destroy the HOA, and that she had powerful connections. Nobody paid attention. Even her closest allies had stopped responding to her messages. As the weekend rolled in, Ember Street felt different. People were talking to neighbors they hadn't spoken to in months. Kids played freely again. Front porches had new flower pots, wind chimes, and colorful doormat. A sense of hope bloomed across the block, quiet but undeniable. Karen's grip on the neighborhood had cracked, and everyone knew it. But they also knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going down without a scene. By the time Monday arrived, there was a quiet electricity in the air that Ember Street had never felt before. Lawns were freshly mowed, porches swept, and conversations buzzed with a level of anticipation usually reserved for parades or major holidays. But this wasn't about bunting or barbecue. This was about power. For the first time since Karen had crowned herself queen of the HOA, the people of Ember Street were pushing back. The community center parking lot filled faster than it ever had for a holiday potluck. People arrived early, some in lawn chairs with coolers, like they were tailgating for justice. There were whispers, exchanged nods, and a shared sense that something permanent was about to happen. Karen arrived last, fashionably late in her newly polished SUV. She stepped out in a tailored red blazer, hair perfectly blow-dried, and marched into the hall with the air of someone walking into a courtroom she thought she owned. She still believed, in that moment, that this meeting would end with her reaffirmed as president and everyone else humiliated. That delusion would be the first thing to break. Inside the community hall, Priya had already organized the vote proceedings. She had made copies of the HOA charter, highlighted the removal clause, and even set up a table for those who had yet to sign. She wore a simple shirt and jeans, no theatrics, just confidence. As Karen walked in, she didn't even glance at her. That stung more than words. People took their seat. Phil, the resigned board member, stood up and announced the beginning of the proceedings. He was technically no longer on the board, but his voice still carried weight. He summarized the situation: the obstruction during a life-threatening fire, the viral incident that brought shame to the neighborhood, the lawsuit filed against the city and neighbors, and the long record of weaponized rules. He didn't embellish or dramatize. He didn't need to. The truth was heavy enough. Karen immediately jumped up to speak, demanding her right to defend her leadership. She began with a lengthy rant about the sacrifices she had made, the time she had invested, and how ungrateful the community was. She claimed the Firetruck incident was a setup, that the fire could have been staged by someone trying to embarrass her. Audible groans rippled through the room. She then pointed directly at Priya and accused her of sowing division for attention. That accusation backfired instantly. A retired teacher stood up and shouted, "You fined my granddaughter for chalk art, Karen. You're not the victim here." Another resident yelled, "My dog got reported for barking at your cat statue." The room turned into a slow-building storm of grievances. Priya stepped forward, calm as ever, and raised her voice just enough to bring silence. She reminded everyone that this wasn't about petty fines or personality clashes. It was about safety. A couple nearly died in a fire while emergency access was blocked. A decision had to be made. Either the community was for order and protection, or it was for unchecked authority. She held up the printed petition with all the signatures and stated clearly that the vote would proceed under the HOA's own bylaws. Voting began. One by one, residents filed to the front to cast their ballot. Karen stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, eyes narrowed into slits, watching like a hawk losing control of the sky. There were no last-minute speeches, no surprise rescues. Just quiet resolution. When the final count was announced, it wasn't even close. Over 70% had voted in favor of her removal. Karen's reign was over. There was no cheering. No celebration. Just a collective exhale. People stood, gathered their things, and walked out into the sunlight, not triumphant but relieved. Priya stayed behind to finish paperwork and inform the city clerk's office. Karen, still frozen in place, looked around at the now empty hall like it had betrayed her. She muttered something about calling a lawyer and stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the flagpole outside. But Karen wasn't done. The next day, Ember Street residents received letters, official-looking documents from a law firm claiming they represented Karen. She was suing the fire department for reckless destruction of property, the HOA for unlawful removal, and several individuals by name, including Priya, for orchestrating a character assassination campaign. The response was swift and collective. Priya gathered the named residents and offered to represent them pro bono. Her father, once fined for illegal bird feeders, offered his garage as legal headquarters. The lawsuit only further united the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the city's legal department, under pressure from media attention, launched its own inquiry into Karen's obstruction during the fire. Investigators arrived on Ember Street, asking for statements, reviewing footage, and collecting witness testimonies. Bodycam footage from the firefighters showed everything. The blocked hydrant, Karen shouting during the emergency, the dramatic dragging of the cart. But there was something else. A bodycam clip previously unreleased, recorded a day before the fire. It captured Karen in conversation with a neighbor, bragging that she didn't care about the fire lane and that, "They can't tow me, I'm untouchable." That footage, when aired on the evening news, flipped the public narrative completely. Public opinion turned brutally against her. Local news stations invited residents to share their stories, and one by one, they did. Retired couples, young families, new immigrants, all spoke about Karen's reign and the tiny humiliations that added up to an atmosphere of fear and resentment. Talk shows picked up the story. Commentators mocked her legal threats and predicted her downfall with glee. Online, Karen's face became a meme once again, now photoshopped into everything from disaster movies to ancient battlefield paintings. Within days, her lawsuit began to fall apart. The fire department's legal team responded with a 70-page counterargument supported by state law and emergency protocol. Priya filed a motion to dismiss with legal citations so sharp the judge called it blistering. Karen's lawyer, overwhelmed by public scrutiny and mounting pressure, withdrew from the case citing client misconduct. Karen tried representing herself at the next hearing. It was a disaster. She rambled about conspiracies, claimed HOA bylaws were unconstitutional, and accused the mayor's office of collusion. The judge dismissed the case entirely and fined her for wasting court resources. Back on Ember Street, something extraordinary began to happen. With Karen gone, the neighborhood transformed. The fire lane was finally painted with clear red stripes and a new emergency access required sign. Priya was nominated to serve as interim HOA president, and within a week, she passed reforms eliminating arbitrary fines and limiting executive power. Residents who had never spoken much before began chatting again. There were potlucks, porch visits, and even plans for a block party. It wasn't perfect, but it felt alive again. As for Karen, she retreated into isolation. Her golf cart, once a symbol of her dominance, sat abandoned on her driveway, rusting and lopsided, a shell of its former self. She still lived on Ember Street, but no one saw her much anymore. Curtains drawn. SUV dusty. Her name was still whispered sometimes, but only as a warning. Karen may have lost the vote, her seat, and most of her control over Ember Street, but she hadn't lost her appetite for conflict. While the community moved on with cautious optimism, she was quietly regrouping. Word spread that she was working with a new legal team out of town, one that specialized in high-profile civil dispute. Nobody thought much of it at first. It seemed like another of her dramatic gestures that would fizzle out like her infamous curfew proposal for teenagers. But then subpoenas started arriving at residents' homes, real ones. Thick, stamped envelopes addressed to Priya, to Phil, to Mrs. Gonzalez, and even to Chief Logan. Karen had filed a multi-party lawsuit in civil court, naming nearly a dozen people and institutions. The charges ranged from character defamation to civil conspiracy to unlawful removal from office. The news hit Ember Street like a cold gust on a warm day. But what Karen hadn't counted on was how prepared her opponents now were. Priya, having anticipated such a move, had already formed a legal defense group made up of neighbors with legal and professional backgrounds. A retired judge who lived 3 blocks away volunteered to advise. A paralegal whose kids played on the community basketball court offered to handle documentation. People who barely made eye contact before now sat around kitchen tables with laptops and legal pads, unified by something stronger than outrage: purpose. The lawsuit was a mess from the start. Karen's new attorney was more showman than strategist, filing motion after motion filled with accusations that bordered on fantasy. One section claimed the Firetruck had been deliberately directed to target her property. Another accused Priya of manipulating the community vote using psychological tactics learned through internet forums. The courtroom quickly became an absurd theater of egos and errors. But the judge presiding over the case wasn't amused. A no-nonsense woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper rulings, she saw through the circus immediately. In the first hearing, Karen arrived with a rolling cart full of documents, flanked by her attorney who looked like he had prepared for a corporate scandal rather than a neighborhood dispute. Priya sat calmly on the opposite side with a few color-coded folders and a notepad. The residents named in the suit filled 2 benches behind her, some dressed in suits, others in everyday clothes, all united by resolve. Chief Logan wore his uniform. He didn't speak during that session, but his presence said everything. When Karen took the stand to present her initial statements, she began by claiming the entire community had orchestrated a smear campaign against her. She spoke of betrayal, emotional trauma, and financial losses due to what she called digital bullying. Then she veered into wild territory, claiming her golf cart was not just a vehicle, but a symbol of her leadership, and that its destruction was comparable to a political assassination. The judge raised an eyebrow and looked toward her attorney, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When it was Priya's turn to respond, she simply submitted into evidence the fire department's bodycam footage, the HOA's recorded meeting minutes, and Karen's own message board post. She didn't need to embellish. The facts were more than enough. Things took a decisive turn when the court ordered discovery, and Karen's private communications had to be disclosed. That's when everything unraveled. Emails between Karen and her hand-picked HOA board members revealed her true intentions behind many of the citations she had issued. One thread showed her mocking a disabled veteran who had requested an ADA-compliant ramp, calling it an eyesore and threatening to fine him for unapproved construction. Another email detailed her plan to block the fire lane permanently with a decorative planter, which she wrote would serve aesthetic purposes, while keeping unwanted city trucks out. Perhaps most damning of all was a text exchange with her attorney where she admitted the lawsuit was about making them pay emotionally, not financially. That message alone shifted the judge's tone from impartial to visibly irritated. Public interest reignited as new revelations came to light. News outlets picked up the story again, dubbing it the Karen Chronicles Part 2. A segment aired on regional television detailing the case, complete with dramatic reenactments of the golf cart incident and interviews with Ember Street residents. The story captured the public's imagination once more, and internet sleuths found new angles to meme and dissect. Karen became the subject of a viral parody song on TikTok, which racked up over 1 million views in a week. But for the residents of Ember Street, it wasn't entertainment. It was personal. The court proceedings lasted for several weeks, each session peeling back more layers of Karen's campaign of control. More neighbors came forward with testimonies. A former board member admitted he had resigned in secret shame after being pressured to fine families unfairly. A delivery driver who serviced the neighborhood recalled how Karen once physically blocked his van and accused him of lurking. Even a teenage boy testified that Karen had reported him to animal control for walking 2 dogs at once, claiming he was operating an illegal kennel. By the final week, Karen's legal team had begun to disintegrate. Her attorney filed a motion to withdraw from the case, citing irreconcilable differences and a lack of cooperation. Karen tried to argue the next session herself. It was disastrous. She rambled about neighborhood values, warned of a coming legal storm, and insisted she was the only person capable of saving Ember Street from decline. The judge interrupted her mid-sentence, delivered a stern lecture about abusing the court system, and dismissed her case with prejudice, meaning she couldn't file it again. But it didn't end there. The judge also issued a countersanction, fining Karen for filing frivolous lawsuits and wasting judicial resources. The city followed with its own action, billing her for the fire department's delayed response due to the blocked hydrant. The HOA, now under Priya's guidance, passed new rules protecting emergency access lanes with concrete legal backing. Karen was ordered to pay restitution and was formally barred from holding any HOA position again. It was the final nail in a coffin she had built herself, brick by brick, with arrogance and denial. Back in the neighborhood, relief took the form of small celebrations. A retired couple hosted a backyard movie night and screened a lightly edited version of the bodycam footage with playful sound effects added. Kids drew chalk outlines of golf carts on the sidewalk with caution tape and toy firetrucks parked beside them. Even the mailbox Karen had once declared too decorative was now painted bright orange and covered in sunflowers. People didn't pretend things were perfect, but they were lighter. Neighbors waved more. Porch lights stayed on longer. Conversations flowed without fear of being reported. Ember Street had fought off more than just a power-hungry HOA president. It had survived a campaign of fear, of control disguised as structure, of authority abused in broad daylight. What Karen had tried to build was a kingdom of silence. What the community had rebuilt was something entirely different. They had turned a fire lane into a line in the sand, and when the time came, they held it. The story of Ember Street didn't just end with Karen's courtroom defeat, it evolved. After the dust settled, something remarkable began to happen in the neighborhood. The tension that had long lingered in driveways and behind hedges gave way to a sense of community that hadn't existed in years. It was as if the dragging of that golf cart had pulled more than just metal behind it. It had dragged out fear, resentment, and silence. In its place was something far stronger. It started subtly. The new HOA, now led by Priya and a committee of volunteers, passed sensible reforms. Fines could no longer be issued without board approval. Emergency lanes were permanently protected. Rules were simplified, clarified, and made public. People knew where they stood. Power wasn't hoarded anymore, it was shared. Residents who had kept to themselves began reintroducing themselves to neighbors. Mailboxes were redecorated. Porch swings were used again. One family hosted a taco night and invited the entire block. Another put up a little free library box, painted bright red with a hand-lettered sign that read, "For Ember Street, no clipboards allowed." People laughed at that one. It had taken years to reach this place, and still, the shadow of what had been loomed in the background. Karen was no longer visible, but her presence hadn't vanished entirely. She stayed in her house, curtains always drawn, yard growing slightly wilder by the week. The golf cart, or what was left of it, sat under a tarp at the edge of her driveway, untouched since the incident. Nobody approached. Nobody needed to. Then came the suggestion that sparked a new kind of closure. A firefighter named Ramon, who had been one of the first on scene during the fire, reached out to Priya with an idea. He proposed a small event, a fundraiser for the department's community safety program, to be hosted right on Ember Street. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The street that once blocked a firetruck would now welcome it. Priya loved the idea. The neighbors embraced it. Plans were drawn up. Permits secured. Tables, decorations, banners, and most importantly, a food truck or two were arranged. The community chose a Saturday 2 months after the final court date. The event was named Ember Strong. On the day of the event, the sky was wide and blue, the kind of weather that made everything feel like a second chance. The firetruck returned, this time not in haste, but in celebration. Kids were invited to climb inside, wear plastic helmets, and spray water from the hose into the park's grass. Firefighters signed autographs. The crew that had dragged Karen's cart were the guests of honor, cheered and thanked by name. Chief Logan, normally reserved and quiet, took the microphone and gave a short speech about the importance of community trust and preparedness. He didn't mention Karen once. He didn't have to. Everyone understood. There was music, laughter, and more conversation than Ember Street had heard in a decade. But the centerpiece of the day wasn't a firetruck or a food stall. It was the strange sculpture at the center of the lawn. Built by a local artist and unveiled at noon, it was titled Obstruction. At first glance, it was a mess of bent metal, charred plastic, and jagged wheels. But as people walked around it, they saw what it really was: the remnants of Karen's golf cart, repurposed and welded into a chaotic but strangely poetic form. At the base, a plaque read, "Never park in the fire lane." Kids posed next to it. Adults stared a little longer. It was part warning, part catharsis. The object that had once represented control now stood as a monument to resilience. Karen, though uninvited, did something no one expected. That afternoon, she stepped out of her house. She didn't speak. She didn't walk into the crowd. But she stood on her porch for a long time, watching the gathering. Some saw her. Most ignored her. It wasn't a protest or a plea. Just a woman realizing the world had moved on without her. Whether she felt anger or regret, no one could say. Eventually, she went back inside. She didn't come out again. Later that night, as the fundraiser wound down, Priya found herself sitting on the curb beside Chief Logan. They shared a plate of leftover street tacos and watched the last of the decorations being taken down. He mentioned that he'd be retiring next year, thinking of moving upstate near his daughter. Priya thanked him for everything. He smiled and said the real thanks belonged to the neighborhood. "You didn't just vote her out," he said. "You rewrote how people here live together." That stayed with her. Over the following weeks, the sense of unity persisted. Ember Street wasn't perfect, but it was finally real. People began organizing monthly neighborhood dinners. Kids played late into the evening. Even the community center got a facelift with volunteer labor. One man donated a projector for movie night. A woman offered to run yoga classes on Saturdays. Yes, the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen's house eventually went up for sale. The listing was quiet, without any fanfare. No open houses, no signs of activity. Just one morning, a white van pulled up and movers began loading boxes. No one saw her leave. Some wondered if she was embarrassed, others thought maybe she had convinced herself she was still the victim. But no one chased after her. No one asked her to stay. When the house finally sold, the new owners were a young couple with twin toddlers and a rescue dog. On their first day, nearly every neighbor stopped by to introduce themselves. The woman laughed as her dog rolled in someone's flower bed and apologized. The man asked where he could get his mailbox repainted to match the rest. They hadn't even unpacked, and already they felt like they belonged. That night, as porch lights flicked on one by one, Ember Street looked and felt whole again. People will always remember what happened there. Not just the fire, not just the dragging of a golf cart down the road, but what followed. How fear was replaced with voice, how silence was broken by laughter, and how control was overtaken by community. Sometimes it takes a ridiculous, viral moment to crack the shell. But what really matters is what people do once the shell is broken. Years from now, when someone asks about the sculpture in the park or the bright red fire lane at the curb, they'll hear the story. Not just of the cart or the woman who parked it, but of the people who stood together when it mattered. Of the fire that nearly took lives, and the unity that saved far more than that. And maybe, just maybe, someone will smile and say, It all started when the firetruck dragged the wrong cart. But they'll mean the right one,